Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. Now, I think I've probably done as many videos as a human being can possibly do on the voice referendum, although you never know, some other issue might come up. But in the meantime, I thought I'd do a couple of videos about something I've been looking at recently, which is the government's exposure bill called the Communications Legislation Amendment Combating Misinformation and Disinformation Bill 2023. Now, I think we can all probably agree that misinformation and disinformation, which spread like wildfire on the internet through social media, are a bad thing. Of course, first we need to know what those terms mean. So for present purposes, and we'll come to the more complex definition later, let's just say misinformation is meant to mean false, misleading or deceptive content, which is reasonably likely to cause serious harm. And disinformation is spreading that misinformation, but deliberately for the purpose of deceiving people. So that's what we're talking about here. And we also are probably all aware that foreign actors have in the past and will continue to spread misinformation and disinformation on the internet to undermine Australia's democracy and its processes like elections, and also to undermine our social cohesion as a nation. So for those reasons, they are good reasons why we do need to take some action to combat misinformation and disinformation. On the other hand, however, we do also need to be very, very cautious that the cure does not end up being worse than the disease. And so what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, there is a serious risk that in combating misinformation and disinformation, we seriously undermine freedom of speech, which is a pillar of that system of democracy that we're trying to defend. And by restricting or knocking down that pillar, we might actually make the situation even worse than the problem that we're trying to cure. So, how does this bill operate in that environment? Does it successfully deal with combating misinformation and disinformation while appropriately protecting free speech? In my opinion, no. I think there are serious problems with the bill. So I'm going to try and explain that. In fact, I'm probably going to do 2 or 3 videos here just because it's a bit complex and there's a lot of material to get through. So I'm going to look at that and try and explain to you why I think there are problems with this current proposal. So what does this bill actually do? Well, first of all, it gives certain powers to the Australian Communications and Media Authority, otherwise known as ACMA. They include powers to require the production of information and to require people to give evidence before it, etc., but largely a power to oversee and regulate codes of conduct which are then given effect by the various large social media companies like Facebook and Google and Twitter, etc. Now, why that approach? Well, probably because the government knows that the Australian people would be absolutely up in arms if ACMA itself was to be the one that was assessing what was misinformation and disinformation. It would immediately be classed as being a ministry of truth, and people would be, rightly, very concerned about it. But the effect by having this legislation, which indeed requires various industry sectors and digital platforms to have these codes to deal with misinformation and disinformation, is that we outsource the censorship to be determined by these large foreign corporations. So then you've got to ask yourself, are you feeling confident that censorship of contentious political matters or social or environmental or scientific matters in Australia is determined by these corporations? I have to say, just as much as I would be unhappy about ACMA doing it, I'm also very unhappy about these organisations having that power or that responsibility outsourced to them. So how would they in fact deal with misinformation and disinformation? Well, there's a number of ways they can deal with it. The first is that when they receive complaints about it, they can remove it from their digital platforms. Or secondly, they can demote it in the algorithm, so it doesn't get priority when you do a search on Google, or it doesn't get recommended to you on YouTube, etc., etc. So they make it hard to find, in other words. Thirdly, they can refuse to take advertisements from people who are advertising disinformation or misinformation. And fourth, they can refuse to let it be monetized as well. So they're the four main things that these digital platforms can do to deal with misinformation and disinformation on their platforms. Now, the important thing here is to actually define what is misinformation for these purposes. The definition is complex, but it then leads to the problem of having to then make all the various judgments involved. So in terms of misinformation, this is what it says. Misinformation is defined as being content that contains information that is false, misleading, or deceptive, and is not excluded content for misinformation purposes, and we'll come back to that definition, and is provided on a digital service to end users in Australia, and is reasonably likely to cause or contribute to serious harm. Okay, that's the definition that's provided. So the first thing is what's this excluded content for misinformation purposes that they're talking about? What are they excluding there? And so when we start looking at that, we see that they exclude from misinformation anything published by professional news organisations, anything that is authorised government content, be that Commonwealth or state or local government, also content that is produced by or for an accredited educational institution, and also content that's produced in good faith for purposes of entertainment, parody, or satire. Okay, now when you look at those categories, one of the first things you're probably going to figure out is that the first ones that I mentioned are all identified by reference to the source or the provenance of the material, where it comes from, not the actual content of the subject matter of the misinformation. And that is really problematic, because when you're then trying to identify your misinformation, what happens when a claim X, shall we call it, which is false and likely to lead to serious harm, is made on the one hand in professional news material by a professional news organisation, or is made by government, and then on the other hand is made by, Joe Blow or Gertie Snerd on the internet. Is it misinformation? It's not misinformation according to this, because it's excluded when it's on a media story, but if it's made by some ordinary person on YouTube or Twitter or whatever, then all of a sudden it is misinformation. So how does that work? Is it then not in misinformation if Gertie Snerd publishes it on the internet, so long as she does so by retweeting a professional news media article? Or is it misinformation? Not clear. What if she doesn't retweet the article, but she repeats the claim and then attributes it to the particular article? Is that misinformation or not? And if that's not misinformation, is it only misinformation if she says the same thing that was in the professional news media article? And we just don't know is the answer. So let me just give you a little practical example here. One of the things that used to bug me when I was teaching was that most of my students came to my public law classes with the belief that Aboriginal people had been treated under law as flora and fauna under a statute called the Flora and Fauna Act, and that was the case until the 1967 referendum. Now, if you go searching, well, first of all, I should say that is completely false, okay? No such law exists. It is absolutely false. And is it also something that reasonably contributes to serious harm? My assessment, yes, because there are a lot of people who are distressed and devastated about the fact that they or their relatives were treated not as human beings, but by law were regarded as flora and fauna. Okay, so for present purposes, let's assume that that's misinformation in that context. So is it, though, excluded misinformation content because you can find that allegation in numerous stories in the news media over time. Go searching, you'll find it all over the place. And reputable news organisations as well. You can also find it in educational materials. As I said, most of my students were taught that at school, and you can find it in civics textbooks, God help us. So it's in educational material. You will also probably find it in government material. Certainly you can find it in Hansard, technically parliamentary material, but nonetheless, probably if you search hard enough, you can find it in governmental materials too. So if that misinformation is being spread on the social media, digital platforms, by ordinary people, but if they refer to and quote from, any one of those sources, does it make it disinformation or misinformation or not? And that's the thing that this Act is completely unclear about it, because it's mixing up content in terms of the subject matter, which is false, misleading, etc., with the provenance of where it comes from. So what does a social media, digital platform organisation do when faced with that kind of a problem? Assuming, for present purposes, and I'm no expert on the technology side, but I'm assuming that you're going to have to go scraping through the internet trying to pull this stuff off in some kind of a automated or mechanical way, you're not going to be able to make those kind of distinctions between whether or not it came from a particular source or whether or not when it was a normal human being published it, they were referring to a particular source that was exempted. So if you're the media organisation, if you're the digital platform and you're required to remove or deal with misleading misinformation, you're presumably going to do it in such a way as you just chuck the whole lot out. So there's nothing in this law that says you can't remove all that extra stuff. When the law says that, your codes, etc., exclude this kind of misinformation content if it comes from professional media organisations, etc., it's just saying that this law doesn't require you to take that stuff out. But the consequence, I would imagine, would be overkill on the platform side, because you just take out the lot, wouldn't you? And so the consequence is likely to be that all that protected stuff from governments, stuff educational material, the sort of stuff from professional media organisations, etc., will all get washed out in the kind of censorship that these digital platforms will need to impose. Now, one of the other mysteries in this is the definition in relation to educational material. So it describes it as content produced by or for an educational institution. So what does that actually mean? Does it mean, for example, research articles produced by academics employed by a university? I mean, that stuff isn't actually produced by or for the university, the educational institution itself. Is it only produced by or for if it's published in a journal, etc., something that's actually published by the university? What if it's published in a peer-reviewed journal which is published by a commercial publisher? Does that make a difference? Is that then not protected? It's really unclear what is actually covered. And does it still work? For example, if you're me, someone who has been employed for a long time as an academic, but I've now retired from being an academic, but I am a professor emerita, which means that all my research is still counted by the university, and I have to still comply with all the university's codes and, heaven help me, do all their modules, etc., etc. So does that mean I'm still within? And does it only mean that my material is not able to be regarded as misinformation if I publish it as scholarly material? And what if I'm doing a YouTube video? Okay, so what if I'm doing misinformation here on YouTube Does the fact that I'm a Professor Emerita mean that this is not misinformation for the purposes of these codes? I got no idea. And how on earth is a social media platform to be able to figure any of this kind of stuff out? The whole of this draft bill is written in a way that from a practical point of view would make it virtually impossible to properly implement. In the end, you would just have to imagine that the digital platform would just have to go over the top and wipe out, anything it thought was going to cause it trouble, regardless of any of these distinctions that are made. And the final bizarre distinction that's also made in this excluded content is the one that relates to entertainment and satire and parody. First of all, your digital platform would have to make an assessment as to whether or not you were doing it in good faith. And how on earth are they supposed to tell that? And the other thing is, it would just then encourage people who are deliberately purveying misinformation or disinformation on digital platforms to just do it in an entertaining way. If you can do it as a parody or a satire or in a way that looks like entertainment, you make it funny, which many of them do, well, A, you get more people watching. I mean, compare someone who is funny and doing their education with me, and I'll bet you that they've got way more subscribers than I do. But all it does is just herd people into making it a form of dissemination of misinformation by light entertainment on digital platforms. And so long as you can argue that you're doing it in good faith, then hey, stick out as much misinformation and disinformation as you like. All up, this whole idea of excluded content for misinformation purposes is a bit of a fiasco. So the next problem with all of this is who assesses what is false, misleading or deceptive, and how do they make that assessment? Now, the first point here is that ACMA has claimed that it's not the one that's going to be removing material, it's not the one that's going to be deciding on truth, that is being left to the digital platforms to decide. And yes, that's true in part, but because the role of ACMA and all those legal powers that's being given under this particular bill is to ensure that this code is being effectively operated by the digital platforms, it does actually mean to make some kind of assessment as to whether or not something is misinformation or disinformation, to be able to assess whether or not these digital platforms are dealing with it appropriately. So bottom line is that effectively ACMA will be at an underlying level making these kinds of assessments as to what is misinformation and disinformation. Secondly, although the primary role in doing that is with the platforms, there are real issues about how you decide whether something is false, misleading or deceptive. So let's just take a really basic proposition. Let's look at scientific fact. Okay, so what if you have a general consensus of scientists that a certain fact is true? Does that then mean that you use these codes to suppress or remove material on digital platforms that challenges that? Because the thing about science is that the way it progresses is when people do challenge, and over time the consensus will change. We can't just be left frozen in one position because we don't allow discussion out there from people who are challenging the status quo. So let's just take a recent example. COVID-19, how does it spread? You remember at the very beginning of the pandemic, people said, there was a scientific consensus that it was spread by droplets. And we had all those people out there cleaning surfaces, right, left and centre. Whereas about 2 years later, the WHO said, oh, well, actually, yes, we now agree it is an airborne disease. And had we, instead of being cleaning surfaces, actually dealing with things like ventilation of buildings, then we might have saved a lot more lives. Now, what would have happened if if the people who said, no, we don't think it's being spread by droplets, is actually an airborne disease, if their views had been suppressed as misinformation? So, there was some finding that you weren't allowed to say those things on social media. Would that have made things worse and caused serious harm? Well, potentially it could well have done. To take another example, what about war? As we all know, the first casualty in war is truth. There's an awful lot of misinformation and disinformation about wars. But we also know that you probably never can accurately find out the facts about what's happening during a war until well after the war is over. So you won't know who blew up that bridge or whether country X deliberately bombed a hospital or any of those sorts of things because A, a lot of the factual material is suppressed for security reasons, for good reasons. B, journalists are going to be really restricted in how they have access to areas and who they can talk to and what they can report on. And C, both sides will engage in a massive amount of propaganda. And that means that you really can't genuinely make assessments of what is truth, what is false or misleading or deceptive in the course of a war. So for all these reasons, this sort of idea that you can easily go out and assess what is misinformation or disinformation is often problematic at the very least. So then who actually does the assessment? And this is where it's really unclear. One of the things you find in the proposed legislation is reference to these digital platforms supporting fact checkers. So you have independent fact-checking organisations funded by the big digital platforms in order to make assessments. Now, I do a lot of answering questions from fact checkers on various kinds of constitutional legal matters. And so I have a fair idea of what goes on there. And the value and the accuracy of a fact checker's report will depend significantly on things like who they ask. So which experts do they actually ask? Because sometimes you'll get different answers. And who actually answers the request, because many of the experts are way too busy to spend half their life answering questions from fact checkers. I know this is true. I actually do prioritise it, but nonetheless, a lot of other people don't. So that's a problem. But equally the problem is whoever is writing the fact check report will often not be an expert in the field. They're getting expertise from other people who are the genuine experts, but they're not understanding the detail of what they are being told by those experts. So when the fact checker takes in the various quotes from people and puts it all together in a little package and makes their fact-checking report, often they don't understand the technical issues or the nuances involved, and sometimes you get fact-checking reports that are actually just wrong. And I have seen that from time to time. I've seen times where I have told a fact checker something and I've actually later read what they've written and thought, oh my goodness, they really completely misunderstood that. So the thing about fact checking is they can be great. There's a lot of really good material out there, but they're not infallible. And if you're using fact checking reports as the arbiter of truth for the purposes of suppressing or removing information from digital platforms, then they're going to need to be doing a much, much better job. And even then, I don't think that you can totally rely on them. And the final point I'll make on this video is that there is so much room for different judgments on the various aspects of the definition of misinformation and disinformation, that reasonable organisations having the best faith in the world and being the brightest, smartest people in the world can come to completely different conclusions as to whether or not something is misinformation or disinformation. So take, for example, the element of the definition which says, is reasonably likely to cause or contribute to serious harm. Well, just look at all the stuff in there where you need to make a judgment. Is it reasonably likely to cause something, or to contribute to something, or to create serious harm. So many value judgments being made there by someone, a digital platform, ACMA, a fact checker. It has to be the case that they could all take different views on where the line is drawn. And if that's the case, then you'll end up in a circumstance where digital platform A thinks assertion X is misinformation, digital platform B thinks it's not misinformation because it doesn't lead to serious harm, or it's not reasonably likely to do so, or it falls in one of the exceptions, etc., etc. ACMA may take a different position as well and say to one of the digital platforms, the one that doesn't think it's misinformation, well, you're not doing the code properly because you've let this assertion propagate throughout the internet. And there's nothing in this legislation that shows you, well, how do you manage that people could reasonably take different views as to what is misinformation and disinformation. All up, to me, it seems to be a bit of a fiasco. It needs to be something that needs to be far more properly thought through and far more practical in its terms to be able to make a system that is effective while at the same time not resulting in potentially complete overkill by digital platforms that say, well, we can't make all those fine distinctions, so let's just wipe out the entirety of categories of discussion on things so that there's only one authorised truth that people are allowed to discuss through digital platforms, because I think that would be a very, very bad outcome, an outcome that was worse than the problem that you're trying to combat. Okay, thanks you for joining me on the Constitutional Clarion. I'll come back with a couple of other videos about this particular issue. One I'm going to do on political advertising and how that's going to be affected by this, or political communication. And a third one on the interesting range of constitutional escape clauses that are also in the bill. So come back and have a look at those. Thanks very much. See you next time.